Hello, I'm Aaron Kant and this is my final submission video for my Computer Game Studio 2 project, ValkPPF. In this video, I'll be covering a number of key interesting components, as well as the issues and future developments of this project. Much like my first project, ValkPPF was based on a pre-existing personal concept, in this case, a puzzle platformer controlling the telekinetic deity, Valkyrie. While the original concept was a fairly slow-paced puzzle game in the vein of games like Portal, I could not think of a suitable theme that fit both this style and the character. This resulted in a partial design shift partway through the project, instead taking inspirations from PS2 era 3D platformers and combining it with the pre-existing telekinesis controls. The core mechanic of the telekinesis controls is the ability to switch between a platforming-centric mode and an over-the-shoulder third-person shooter-style camera to allow for the grabbing of objects. When in this TK mode, any object that has been assigned an appropriate tag can be picked up and moved around freely. This system was one of the first things developed, with the core detection method of firing a line trace on the player persisting throughout the entire development. The movement itself, however, had some iteration. The very first system simply added translation values and thus didn't coordinate correctly with the camera viewpoint. The second solution, which became the basis for the final version, was to use a small invisible box as a kind of helper to indicate where the object should go. The held object has its position vector interpreted to the position of the helper, which is offset from the player based on the cursor position, using another line trace. This system allows for the object to move based on camera position, as well as move with the player. Various tweaks and additions will be made, such as the switching of the axis movement from XZ to XY has proved more comfortable, using a curved interpolation instead of linear to give it a more floaty effect. The last major addition, however, was the anti-clipping system. Originally, the helper could pass through walls and objects without issue, causing issues in which the held object could clip through walls just by moving the helper far enough away. The solution to this was alternating between having the helper position set both by the end of the line trace and also whenever the line trace hits something. This means whenever the trace for the helper hits something, the helper will track it, preventing it from penetrating anything. While removing the ability to move objects behind other objects, this almost entirely removes clipping, as the helper cannot pass through and pull the held object with it, although it is still possible to clip objects by getting an object stuck behind something, which is an unlikely non-game breaking scenario. While not initially having much idea on how to implement it in a gameplay sense, having some kind of throw in a telekinesis-focused game felt like a necessity. TK Throw was implemented very early on, shortly after the helper system was first implemented, initially only being a single fixed throw and becoming a charge and release system shortly after. After this point, it remained functionally the same for the rest of the project, even after TK Lock-On was added to accompany it. TK Throw works on a simple timeline system. When the throw key is held and the prerequisites met, such as being in TK mode and holding an object, a power meter HUD widget is displayed and a timeline is started, causing the meter to fill. Releasing the button at any point will cause the held object to be simultaneously dropped and velocity added to it, scaled by the amount the meter is charged. The thrown object is given a tag to designate it as being thrown, used to communicate with other objects that use it. While TK Throw was useful as a fun physics tool to mess around with, it turned out to be fairly inept at actually registering hits on breakable objects, due to the fire and forget nature of its implementation. To counter this, I had the idea of a lock-on system, where painting the crosshair over an object while charging the TK Throw would then mark the chosen object as a target, with releasing then turning the held object into a homing projectile. This system has remained fairly consistent since its initial implementation, save for aesthetic tweaks. When the throw button is held, the trace normally used for scaling the crosshair distances will also start to detect objects that have an IsTK lock-on tag applied to them. When this is detected, the hit object will begin to emit particles and have a lock-on target placed at it. This can be overwritten by hovering over another compatible object. Now when the throw button is released, a spline is drawn between the held object and the target object, with either an underarm or overarm arc depending on which object is higher. And the held object is then instructed to follow the spline to the target object, with the speed being scaled based on distance between the two. When the thrown object is obstructed, either by the target object or anything else, the movement is cancelled and the object receives a small upwards boost using the regular TK throw code to give the impact some sense of cartoonish weight. Iterations of this system mostly came in the form of the arcing movement, as it was originally using a V-interp instead of a spline, as well as the necessity to have TK throw at full charge in order to activate it. Another system implemented early on was TK Pulse, which is a means to highlight objects that can be grabbed using the telekinesis. While the actual highlighting has always been the same, using a highlight material assigned using the custom depth pass, the actual delivery was changed quite a large amount towards the end. Initially, every TK object had to have the custom def pass enabled manually, with the pulse button simply enabling the opacity for the highlighted material for a short time. Eventually, an echolocation effect was added, using an inverted sphere with a depth fade material applied. This sphere grows rapidly to encompass the level, applying the custom def pass to anything it hits with a TK grab tag. A second invisible ring is then sent out, removing the def pass and returning the objects back to normal. While this works properly most of the time, there are random instances where faraway objects will have the def pass stuck on, causing them to be permanently highlighted until the pulse is done again. While I was unable to find a solution or a cause for this, I determined it to not be a game-breaking issue. TK2 mode was implemented around the time the puzzle-centric gameplay was scrapped and reworked into the final concept. At this time, the movement speed for Valk was incredibly slow. The long spine model used for TK2 was already being used for TK4, and I felt it could have a greater implementation due to liking the design. At this point, I decided to implement a powered-up form that would make use of the model and allow for faster traversal. To balance this, a power meter was added that drains down when in use, stunning the player for a short time if fully drained. The transition for animation for TK2 was the first instance of additive animation used in the project, with the transition blending with any currently playing animation, such as running, jumping or ledge grabbing. Once the transition is complete, the model is swapped for a separate one with longer spines and upturned fur, as well as switching to a separate set of animations for moving and jumping. The player speed is handled by affecting values in the character movement property, increasing the movement speed and jump height. This form allows for some platforms to be bypassed that would otherwise require a contextual TK object to be activated, but is not game-breaking as it disables the double jump active in Valk's base form. Cosmetic effects such as lightning and an aura are active in this form, with the lightning being a preset mesh that spins rapidly around Valk, being toggled on and off to give the illusion of it arcing around the body. The aura is handled by two simple half circles with a transparent panning material applied to each. A game-changing feature implemented very late into development was TK Passive. This was implemented due to a main puzzle requiring the transport of objects through a platforming section. As TK mode was not designed for platforming, it resulted in a clunky loop of throwing the object, exiting TK mode, platforming, picking it back up, and repeating. I had the idea of some kind of passive grab previously, but feared that having the object float around the character would interfere with the platforming. I later had the idea of Valk compressing the object into a smaller size and carrying it on his back. To best realise this, I decided that placing the object in a small psychic bubble attached to one of Valk's spine bones would be one of the best courses of action. The system works as such. When TK mode is exited while still holding an object, the object is physically connected to a pre-existing passive helper object on Valk, which also scales the held object to a much smaller size. The bubble mesh, which is a transparent sphere with a world of weapon texture applied to it for a warping appearance, is then made visible and scaled based on the bounding sphere of the grabbed object, ensuring it will fit correctly regardless of the TK object. Now that this object is connected to Valk, he is free to platform normally with the object always following behind, essentially acting as a practical cosmetic. When TK mode is re-entered, the object is detached given its original scale and automatically TK grabbed, functioning as if grabbed normally. This system works with anything that can be grabbed, with the object retaining any properties it had before being passive grabbed, such as the burnable wood pieces continuing to burn even when in the bubble. The only bug that the system has, oddly, is that it causes TK mode to be entered twice, once when the passive grab ends, and again if the player tries to exit TK mode as normal. While this is something that would seem simple to fix, any solution I tried just wouldn't work, although it isn't game breaking at all and the system works perfectly fine otherwise. Another influence that brought on the project changeover was the desire to add non-playable characters that would give a greater sense of world and personality. All the possible themes for the previous gameplay I could think up would have lacked an opportunity for this. With the chosen revised theme of a remote hamlet, I created 4 NPCs, with one being a pre-existing character and the other 3 being entirely new for this project. These were an elder ferret, a farmer bear, and a crackpot jackrabbit. The pre-existing character was the village guardian Blade the Dragon. These characters were created in tandem with the objectives in the level, plus giving the player objectives and accompanying NPC to talk to. The dialogue for all the NPCs are handled using data tables in a single multi-use dialogue object blueprint. A custom data struct is used to define a line of text, as well as its UI icon, with each character having a unique icon, body animation, with each character having a variation of an idle pose, happy, sad and thinking poses, as well as an unused value for character expressions that prove to be unnecessary. The dialogue object receives lines from these data tables, passing each line's text between the player blueprint and the Game HUD UI widget. For each line, the text is taken and read one character at a time on the gameplay HUD, sending a signal per text character for usage in character mouth movement. When the last line of the data table is reached, the dialogue object is stopped and controls return to the player. This allows the data table to have as many lines as needed. Character animation is handled by communicating between the dialogue object and the animation blueprint of the NPC model, which can be set up quickly as it is near identical between all NPCs, save for swapping out the animations for ones relevant to the NPC's model. The dialogue object receives an integer that determines which animations to use, setting a boolean for the animation blueprint that changes the animation. The animations themselves are fairly basic loops that are ease in and out transitioned. Mouth animations are set per text character with a delay, using an additive animation to move the character's mouth generally in sync with the text characters. This also has the option to play a sound, intended for Banjo-Kazooie-esque gibberish, although I did not find time to record any lines for this. This function is present, however, on the hint objects, which borrow code and information from an off-screen dialogue object. The data table system allows for character dialogue to be simply switched out by only changing the table. This is used by several objects such as the farmer's crop box, the river crystal, and the crackpot's water wheel to give before and after dialogue relative to the situation. For character aesthetics, I always had the intention of using a banded cell shading effect to create a graphical appearance somewhat akin to Zelda Breath of the Wild, although with an overall appearance more similar to the excellent shading in Dragon Ball FighterZ. While that kind of approach is not truly possible to replicate, as FighterZ uses a lot of forced perspective and manual lighting placement, I still found ways of achieving a fairly sharp banded shading effect. As custom def was already being taken up by TK Pulse, using an actual banded shader was not possible, so instead I opted for using a Fresnel system. I set up a custom material function named MF-Hard-Fresnel that creates a Fresnel and contrasts it to the point of becoming a sharp edge. This is then paired with a secondary Fresnel of a smaller size, with both having lowered opacities. This function can then be easily added as a multiply component or as an alpha for a lerp, while producing a nice crisp shading effect, especially when paired with the reusable mesh outline material that I created to apply to practically any object. It has obvious limitations. As it is a material additive instead of real shading, it's not affected by any lights or shadows in the level, and to achieve the correct anime-esque appearance in the material, it is required that the material is unlit, meaning character lighting is not present on Valk or any of the NPCs. I don't feel this is a great detriment to the visual appearance, however. Another aspect of the character aesthetics with a large impact on the game is the dynamic nature of Valk's palette. Instead of using a single texture per colour, Valk's body colours are instead split between each body part and combined into the final appearance. This system allows for an unlockable skin selector to be present. This allows the player to individually change each of Valk's colours to fit their preference, using hue, saturation and value sliders. These feed into each individual body part colour, which is then sent to whatever materials make use of them. This also allows for any effects matching a colour on Valk to inherit the colour changes. This is most evident on the telekinesis effects, which normally inherit the blue and orange from Valk's horns and spines respectively. These change to whatever the player sets these horn and spine colours to, keeping the visual change consistent. This also applies to TK Pulse, which inherits from Valk's fur colour instead. While I greatly enjoyed this project overall, there were no shortage of issues throughout. One of the main issues was the gameplay shift halfway through the development. While I believe this did result in a better project overall, it also meant that most level design and assets had to be scrapped, with the only holdover to make it into the final project being a simplified version of the buoyancy puzzle. Another issue was my time management. While I fared somewhat better managing time in this project compared to my usual, as time management is something I've always struggled with, it was still evident the majority of the development was either done towards the start of the project or at the very end, with the amount done in the final week in particular being very large. Due to this, there are many aspects of the project that are clearly lacking. Many textures in the level come from a single sheet of solid colours, many interactions are missing audio, and the audio itself is mostly borrowed from other games, specifically Zelda Breath of the Wild, Little Big Planet, and one sound used from Sonic Generations. The intro and outro cutscenes are also just loosely animated sketches made in a few hours as opposed to something more substantial. Despite this, I made it a top priority to ensure that there were no blatantly missing features, such as missing textures, assets, or gameplay sections. I do wish to continue on this project, although I feel that while the concept can certainly work, a more solid and focused foundation will be useful in ensuring the gameplay is as fun as it can be. While the advent of TK Passive at the end of the project greatly improved the gameplay experience, I feel that both the platforming and puzzle aspect were lacking in the level design. I feel I could have made greater use of the prospects of a telekinetic character, but the systems I already had in place were not suited to properly accommodate it. This is the reason for a lack of the restrictive yet freeform telekinesis elements that could exist, such as platforms that could be pulled out manually based on user preference. I also feel that the platformer elements themselves were quite minimal, with no combat or complex platforming being present, as a result of the character not being designed for either, although an attempt was made at AI-controlled enemies with poor results. Regardless, I am largely happy with the result of this project, and I feel like I could continue it into something far greater. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.